Thanks again to our partners program for their support in all of our webinars that ILC has had over the several weeks now that we've been doing lockdown in the coronavirus crisis. And also thanks to our partners here today. We've got one of our speakers, Jane Ashcroft, is from Anchor Hanover, and they are a longstanding ILC partner and part of our partners program. Let's see, we've got a good number of people already joined. So again, to introduce myself, I'm Dr. Brian Beach. I'm Senior Research Fellow at ILC. And our webinar today is In It Together, Making Housing for Older Adults More Inclusive. This is part of a joint project that ILC is on with University of Bristol, led by Dr. Paul Willis, from whom you'll be hearing later. Also with Housing Lynn, you'll be hearing from them later. And our other respondents are also engaged in this project, being that they have provided some of the housing schemes from which we've sampled and have been conducting interviews. So we're a good group of a well-connected family already, which is great. But before we get into the meat of the webinar today, just a few issues or a few housekeeping issues. Obviously, I think many of us been involved in doing these online and virtual platforms for engagement during this crisis. So please do bear with us if there appear to be any internet issues that come up to affect sound, video. We do have staff in the background to help out if you have any specific concerns. You can get in touch with them by using the chat function. You'll also see through the bar, whether it's at the top or bottom of your screen, you'll see a number of different options, including a Q&A button. That is where you should feel free to pose any questions you would like us to address during the discussion that will happen later in the webinar. Again, if you are having any issues with the connection, do try to send a message to the chat and my colleague will get back to you. If you completely get disconnected, simply use the same link you joined, with which you joined, and you'll come right back into it. For those who are engaged on social media, do tweet and engage on social media with the ILC UK handle and the event hashtag In It Together. You'll see that at the bottom right of the screen throughout the presentations if you need a reminder. And then finally, the webinar is being recorded and live streamed on YouTube for public access. So I hope that by being a part of this, we have your consent to post any questions or mention you in any discussions that we have. Yeah, we are here today to talk about some of the findings from the first phase of the DICE project. The DICE project is Diversity in Care Environments. This is a 2.5-year research study based at the University of Bristol, again with ILC and Housing Lynn, and it's been funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. So our conversation today, you've got some really great speakers and we've got some interesting new findings to report on. But to give you sort of an overarching sense, the project was really going to be talking about these questions of diversity and social inclusion within the housing with care and support sector. And we'll be addressing concepts related to patterns of social experiences. And I've got a bit of analysis to really unpick whether or not these experiences are truly different from the kinds of experiences that people who aren't living in these schemes have. So we do want to hear your views and have you engaged in this conversation, given that diversity and social connections and care environments are hugely important questions, particularly now in retrospect of the experiences through the coronavirus crisis. So again, please do use that Q&A function. And I will be moderating a discussion later on. To give you also a bit of background for those who don't know ILC, we are a specialist think tank on the impact of longevity. We are independent and politically neutral, and we use evidence to inform policy. We also are strengthened through our partners program to work collaboratively so that we can think about solutions for the future. Understanding diversity is key for ensuring longer lives are good for everyone. And part of the discussion really is so that we can look to policy for the future that will work for the future and isn't simply based on what we've seen from the past. And I have at the beginning already mentioned our partners program. We're very thankful for their support, and we're happy to have Anchor Hanover on board and here today. And I'll have a little bit more to say about that at the end. But now I would like to turn over to Dr. Paul Willis. As I mentioned, he has been the lead on the DICE project, and he's senior lecturer in social work with adults at the University of Bristol. We've been friends and colleagues now for quite a while, and he has a strong background looking at these issues of diversity in housing with care schemes. But Paul, over to you.
Thanks, Brian. And just to start off with a very big thank you to the ILC UK for hosting this webinar and working with us and supporting us on this study. It's great to work collaboratively. So as Brian's already mentioned, the DICE study, 2.5-year study, research study funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. And we commenced in the beginning of January 2019. And it's a project in collaboration with ILC UK, with Housing Lynn, based in the School for Policy Studies at the University of Bristol, and working with our 3 housing collaborators, Pobble, Brunelcare, and Anchor Hanover across England and Wales on this study as well. If you want to learn more about the project, please visit our Twitter page, find us at the DICE Project 1. You'll see the Twitter handle there. And I'll put a link to our webpage and website at the end of this presentation. Next slide, please, Brian. So I'd just like to briefly give an overview of what the study is all about, what we're seeking to do, what we want to achieve through this project. So we want to understand more about what does it look like to promote social inclusion in housing with care and support for older people in England and Wales. And we're mainly focusing on adults who are 60 years and over. And we want to examine and identify how housing providers currently promote inclusive, supportive environments within different types of housing schemes. So when we talk about housing with care and support, we're talking about schemes such as extra care, sheltered housing, independent living, retirement support schemes. Any of these types of schemes that include some element of care and support provision provided by the service provider. And that might be on-site care and support services, or it might be off-site, like a floating service. And I've already mentioned the collaborations that we have working with us on this study. Next slide, please. So these are the kinds of questions that we want to explore through this study and that we have been exploring, because we're around about midpoint with this project. Our first question is about to what extent do residents themselves, people currently living in these schemes, view themselves as included and valued in their own home environments. And that could include the strength and quality of their social connections with other residents, with staff involved in the scheme, and their sense of inclusion and belonging within the broader community and neighbourhood in which the scheme is based. We want to find more out about the current approaches and practices that support and sustain social inclusion of residents from social minority or marginalised social backgrounds in housing with care and support schemes. So this could be people living with disabilities. It could be people from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds, people identifying as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or other sexual and gender minority groups. Our third question is about how effective or how beneficial current social inclusion practices and approaches are in these schemes, how useful, helpful these approaches are in recognising and valuing residents' social identities and different life histories. And our last question is about how do residents from diverse social backgrounds, including social minority or marginalised groups, experience transitions or changes in social connections in their housing scheme over time. So that's the 4 questions that we're exploring the study. If we go to the next slide, I'll talk about how we're doing it. There are 3 main methods for conducting this study and answering those questions. The first part, which we completed towards the beginning of this year, was distributing a hard copy self-completed questionnaire. And that questionnaire was completed by older residents currently living in these schemes across England and Wales. And I won't say much more about that now because Brian's going to talk about what we've learned from that study shortly and what the return was like. We've since moved on to the second phase, which is our interviews. So we've been interviewing a range of people involved in schemes, staff who are involved in the provision or the broader management and support of these housing schemes. Residents, of course, we want to learn from and hear their perspectives and their experiences of living within these schemes. And we've got a series of interviews planned with stakeholders. So these are people who are involved in commissioning and funding housing services, involved in policy direction, policy implementation, or might be more broadly involved in advocacy work for older people, which of course includes supporting older people's rights around accessing good and supportive housing. I just wanted to add that, of course, since the coronavirus pandemic hit in the UK in March and we entered that period of lockdown, we've had to adjust how we're doing these interviews. So we've now switched to remote interviewing and we've started doing telephone interviews with both staff and residents. And this has also provided us with a really valuable platform to go back to some of the residents who took part in our interviews in January and February and to learn more about the ways in which COVID-19 lockdown measures have impacted on their current experiences of feeling included and connected in the scheme. So we hope that we will really glean some valuable lessons about how they've experienced that really challenging time and continue to experience that challenging climate. The last method is a series of longitudinal interviews. And what this means is that we've sought out a small group of residents, around 15 residents, who belong to minority groups or have protected characteristics, to use that term from the Equality Act. So they might be from a Black and ethnic minority group, a background, they might identify as LGBT+, they might have a minority faith that is important to them, they may be disabled. But we want to learn over time what their experiences are about feeling connected and transitioning into the scheme where they currently live. So we've deliberately focused on this group of people for a series of 2 to 3 interviews over 4-month blocks. So every 4 months, we're catching up with this group of residents to learn about their experiences. And of course, we'll also be able to learn about their experiences during the recent lockdown measures as well. Next slide, please. I just wanted to finish my introduction with just talking through what we mean by social inclusion. Often when we look in research literature on aging and older people's experiences of older age, there's a lot of discussion about social exclusion and the different kind of social and political drivers which generate barriers for people or that might limit people's life opportunities. But often we don't talk much about social inclusion in later life. And so this is just a diagram to give a sense of the 4 key dimensions that we're talking about when we talk about social inclusion. The first being about the individual resident themselves, their own social identities, and they could be identities that they value in relation to belonging to particular minority groups, their individual characteristics, their attributes. It could be their individual life history and their previous experiences of discrimination or feeling excluded or marginalized in some way, shape, or form. So the first dimension is about that individual resident and their biography and their experiences. The second dimension is about the social environment within the scheme and the social dynamics within that small community. And that's about capturing and understanding the ways in which residents and staff make each other feel included or maybe don't make each other feel included, and the different kind of ways in which people are supportive towards each other, form friendships within schemes, or maybe look outside the scheme for friendships and important social bonds. And that leads me to the third dimension, which is about the built environment and neighbourhood location. So this is about the physical infrastructure of the scheme, the ways in which the physical layout of the scheme supports people or promotes residents to connect with each other, to build up supportive relationships with each other and staff, or the ways in which there might be particular barriers in the physical layout of the scheme that prevents that from happening. And it's also about looking at the neighbourhood location, where the scheme is geographically located. Is it positioned within a close town or community? Is there infrastructure nearby? Is there access to public transport nearby, which enables residents to access other services in their area? And the fourth dimension is we want to understand how wider structural and political factors influence social inclusion within housing schemes. So this could be policy priorities, policy drivers. It could be the ways in which housing schemes and housing providers are supported and funded. So it's a range of those broader macro factors which will have an impact on what the quality of life might look like for residents within individual schemes. Next slide, please, Brian. So that's just a very brief overview of the study, what we're all about, what we're trying to do, and where we are at this point in time. I'd really encourage people to visit our website and also to follow us on our Twitter feed as well, and to keep in touch with us after this webinar, because we'll certainly be having more of these kind of events next year when we're completing the study and we're able to talk about some of the other findings that we've gleaned from our interviews with residents and staff and stakeholders. But I'm going to hand back to Brian now. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Paul. Great, thanks. Yeah, hopefully that's given everyone a good sense of sort of what we're doing and why we're doing it. And I'm going to now go into covering some of the findings from the survey that we did. So, as Paul mentioned, we collected a range of information from residents who live in these housing with care and support schemes. We did so by tapping into the networks with the three partners, Anchor, Hanover, Brunelcare, and Derwentcare. And we were able to, we sent out about just 3,690 surveys that were distributed across these three providers. Granted, you've got a big powerhouse in the sector like Anchor Hanover involved, so we couldn't obviously sample all of them. So we did make a sample from their residences, and so in total we had questionnaires go to 103 different schemes. We got 741 in the end returned to us that were usable. While that's about just over 20% response rate, which is actually quite good in this kind of exercise. It's also nice that we actually got at least one survey from almost every one of the schemes out of 95 of the 103. So the return was quite exciting. Now, in terms of what we ask and sort of why we're asking it, Paul, I think, laid out quite well a lot of the motivation behind the study, the kinds of broader research questions that we were really investigating. But one of the other elements for this aspect, the quantitative survey, was that I helped design it to be to facilitate comparison with ELSA, which is the English Longitudinal Study of Aging. This is a large-scale longitudinal data set that collects a vast amount of information of people aged 50 plus in England. It's a really wonderful resource for those of us who've been studying issues related to later life across a variety of domains. It's got very detailed information about people's health, about their income and pension assets, and various other what we call psychosocial factors. So in doing so, this allowed us to on the one hand, use existing questions, existing validated tools for assessing more complex concepts like quality of life, for example, but to have these ready-made tools that we know are sound. But what it also does, as you'll see at the end of my presentation, is it allows us to then start doing a matching kind of exercise, so that we look at the results from our sample and we look at a similar extracted sample from ELSA to see whether or not people in this kind of housing scheme have different outcomes than people in mainstream housing or not, what the differences are. So our survey then sort of gets categorized into these 6 different modules. Sociodemographics, of course, we need to know things about their gender, their age, a number of questions around their health, both all self-reported, but how they think of their health, but also measures to assess limitations in mobility, questions around psychosocial well-being. This again relates to quality of life, life satisfaction, different aspects of their social networks, in particular friends, family, children. Housing, which itself isn't very prominent in ELSA. So a lot of our housing questions were specifically designed for our study. And then also questions around experiences of discrimination, some of which appear in particular waves of the ELSA study. And so today I'm going to go through some, as you may be already picking up on, there's vast amounts of information, not only in ELSA, but also collected in our survey. So there's no way I could go through everything in this presentation. I'm going to focus on those 3 points you see there on the right, the housing, discrimination, and the social networks. So, like I said, the housing questions, many of them in our survey were specifically designed for our purposes. And we sort of put together this group of questions to assess people's perceptions of their housing schemes as it relates to the social experience, the idea that these are schemes that could facilitate social engagement, provide social activities. We wanted to get a sense of the extent to which people felt they were getting those experiences. And so you'll see we've got 4 questions here, and respondents all answered on the standard 5 Likert scale of strongly agree to strongly disagree. We've got questions around positive experiences, around whether the activities are appropriate, the extent to which they find it challenging to join, and the extent to which they find it uncomfortable. So if you look at the chart there on your screen, the ideal situation would be, your blue and green bars are the first 2 questions. You would have those very high there on the left, and it would decline or not even exist. And then opposite with the other 2. And of course, we're seeing a bit more of a distribution. It's not perfect, but it does show that there's if you sort of take away the one in the middle, the neither bar, that sort of tendency to the center, then you're seeing really high bars in the disagreeing with the negatives, which is a good thing, and then a strong and agreement with the positive things. So on balance, what this is telling us is that there's certainly room for improvement, but people's perceptions are that in their housing schemes, they're getting these kinds of positive experiences, and they have this ability to socialize. With respect to discrimination, there are questions, again, we sort of modeled these from what was in, these were modeled from the questions that existed in certain waves of the ELSA survey. And what I'm showing you here is just that, the people were asked how frequently they experience these items that you see, the poor service, feeling threatened or harassed. And there's different aspects of frequency, so whether or not they experience it multiple times a week or a few times a month, et cetera, et cetera. And this is the vast majority don't, that they report never. And this is sort of outlining how people who say they have experienced them, the proportion of which report those experiences for each of these 5 items here. And I would say, one of the lessons I'm taking from looking at this and sort of overall is in particular this idea that the question of getting poorer service, feeling, that you're experiencing discrimination from service of doctors and hospitals, that is the lowest, in contrast to the highest being this idea of less courtesy or respect. And you sort of can imagine that in broad society, people could certainly feel that they come across aspects of discrimination in more general society much more frequently than they do in these this sort of the healthcare setting. But what we also decided to ask them was whether or not they had seen discrimination from staff in the care setting or from other residents in the care setting. And we did ask, not just toward themselves, but toward others. So, discrimination from staff toward you or other residents, discrimination from residents toward staff or you. I think this is a very good picture because, any discrimination is bad, but they are relatively low percentages. At least we're not dealing with a majority witnessing discrimination. But also the fact that the higher one is coming from other residents. And in a way, it can be much more challenging to address discrimination from, again, that sort of public general perception rather than staff. So it's very good that it's a very small proportion. Only a third of discrimination is coming from, or a quarter if you take it all together, is actually being identified from staff behavior rather than from other residents. I mentioned we asked them about their social connections and their social relations, and I know this is a very busy graph. The things I would draw to, you should really look at is we've got 4 groups here in terms of the nature of the social connection. So from the left, you've got meeting up, then it's phone calls, then it's writing, emailing, and then it's texting. And then this is being assessed, the frequency with connections to children, other family members, or friends. And you're seeing a relatively, there's a lot going on here, obviously. But what it does tell us, if you in particular look at the pink bars, is that very, very few are saying that they're getting rare or never having these kinds of connections. And where you do see the highest levels of those pink bars is in the writing and the emailing, which may be a good thing because perhaps people aren't having to write an email as much because they have more direct meeting or phone calls with their social connections. The last one, the texting one, I think is also interesting because while you've still got a large proportion of people who are not really texting and engaging, you also see those who are doing it multiple times a week. And so there is this sort of, we think about the digital divide. This isn't suggesting something like, exclusion from texting. It's just saying maybe you've got people who just have different, priorities or different desires when it comes to texting. Now, here's where we're getting into some of the more complicated analysis. And I've included a few figures here, which, they're robust. They may sort of modify as we start to do more in-depth, and start to incorporate different aspects, start to do more sensitivity analyses and things like this, getting into the very statistics of it all. But what I thought I would do, Paul outlined the difference that we're sort of trying to put forward and develop conceptually in our work around the idea of social inclusion. I thought since we are trying to take those ideas forward, we are informed by existing work looking at social exclusion. And I thought one of the first things I would do is take work that's been done by Barnes and sort of also related to Thomas Scharf, who's the head of our advisory board for the project. They've looked at, and this was many years ago in the grand scheme of things, looked at this aspect of social exclusion, and Barnes in particular directly related it to the ELSA study. Now, this, when we're starting to think these in-depth, complicated concepts, The language might start to become a bit clumsy, and so I apologize for that. But one of the things in their study of social exclusion was a dimension that looked at social relations. So in a way, this is looking at social exclusion in social relations. This is made up of, in part, by the figures you saw in the previous slide, in that graph about the frequency of contact with other people. It also incorporates some of the data around the closeness of people's connections, and to get into this composite measure that we then sort of have as a cutoff between this means they're socially excluded, and these are the people, and these aren't socially excluded. Now, when you apply this, a modified version of this measure to our existing data, you do see a relatively substantial difference between our DICE sample and when you apply it to the ELSA sample. So about 62% of the DICE sample is excluded, where it's less than half of the ELSA sample. But we know that the people who live in housing with care and support have particular characteristics that make them selected for living in these kinds of environments, whether that's because they've become widowed and so they're looking for a different kind of housing, or they've developed a care need and so they need that care and support delivered. There are multiple factors that make this population different than your average population of older people. So to take this into account, we've applied this propensity score matching approach, which essentially matches people in our sample with people in ELSA who are similar to them. So in a way, we go from talking about apples and oranges to talking about two different kinds of apples. When you apply this matching technique, this difference in the social exclusion, the prevalence of social exclusion disappears. Similarly, along this line, I looked at measures of loneliness. A very common measure of loneliness is labeled in different ways, different places, but a 3-item UCLA score. And what that means is that you ask people 3 different questions and you put their answers to those questions together to have a better measure of loneliness than just the simple question of asking them if they're lonely. And when you do this, you get a score that for each person that ranges from 3 to 9. It's a very skewed distribution. And what I mean by that is you get a lot of people who are score 3, who say that they are not, who don't show up as lonely in the measure. And in fact, about 2/3 of people score either 3 or 4, both within DICE and within ELSA. And I mentioned 3 or 4 because if you don't have a partner, you would instantly go up to 4. So in some ways you can be fully connected but not have a partner and you're still going to score 4 rather than 3. So we see the sort of distribution looks the same. The average score is higher in the DICE sample when you look at them separately. But then when you match them, the results suggest a significantly lower average score for the DICE respondents, which fundamentally suggests that on average, people in housing with care and support, the ones we've sampled, do not experience loneliness to the same extent as similar people living outside of housing with care and support. So bringing all this together, we've got I've put up here some of the primary implications, sort of reiterates a lot of what I've already said. When it comes to those perceptions of housing, there is agreement that the schemes offer positive social opportunities, a lot of really good positive messages that have come from that really give us faith that these kinds of housing schemes are filling the aspirational role in that respect that we hope. But in a way, there's always, you could say there's always going to be scope to improve. And I think that's sort of still the takeaway here. There are ways that we could think about getting those small numbers that think it's challenging and uncomfortable. We want to drive those all the way down to 0. And then again, with the discrimination, Up to a third are experiencing some sense of exclusionary pressure from one place or another. But again, a positive from this is that discrimination from staff is only a third the level that's seen from other residents. So it sort of indicates that, again, room to improve, but we're actually doing really well already. And then finally, I think it really drives home, and it resonates with other research that I've done and other research that has been done elsewhere, that the residents in these housing with care settings, they are not more socially excluded than similar people living in the community, which I've interpreted almost as arguing against the concept that these schemes create ghettos, so that there's this ghettoization of people. Actually, they're no more socially excluded than people who are just living in mainstream housing. And in fact, it seems that this is strengthening some of the evidence we already have that these schemes help reduce average levels of loneliness. So just for me to conclude before I pass along to my colleague Alex, just a flavor of what's going to happen next. So some of those comparative analyses I talked about with ELSA, there are so many variations on a theme in a way that we could do. So we're going to be finalizing some of those analyses and starting to try our best to unpick differences amongst the diverse groups within our sample. Those numbers are quite low when you think you've got 5%, for example, of the sample, and it might be one form of disadvantaged background or protected characteristic that limits what you can do statistically. So we're still exploring which of those are valid. And all of this is going to go into a draft academic paper that we'll publish in a journal as part of this first stage. There will be at the end of the project next year, an ILC policy report that we put together, but we're also generating academic papers for this. And then, and also a final step for anyone out there who's interested, we are going to be producing the user guides and processing this data set for the UK Data Archive, so that other researchers interested in this, because there are very few data sources at this micro level for residents of this sector, this kind of housing. This will be available for other researchers to use in the future. So that, I hope I didn't go too fast for everybody, was some of the findings from the quantitative survey. And we thought we would have our colleague Alex from University of Bristol give an overview, a little bit of some of the initial findings we've gathered from some of the qualitative field work. So Alex, over to you.
Thanks, Brian. I've worked on the quantitative survey with Brian and also on the phase 2 qualitative part. But at the end of the questionnaire, we gave respondents a chance to tell us in their own words what activities made them feel included in their housing setting, and what about those activities that make them feel included and welcome. So we just thought it'd be worth mentioning some of these comments that were mentioned in the open-ended qualitative questions at the end of the questionnaire. So 381 survey respondents commented on the questions at the end of the survey, and a lot of them just listed activities that were taking place. But it's been noted that these activities, they were all related to socialising, meeting other residents, a chance to share experiences and a chance to chat to others. And as you can see here, here's some examples of the activities that were listed and were taking place across the schemes from the 3 providers. So you've got usual things here: coffee mornings, bingo, quizzes, and that's a long list of the things that were mentioned. Next slide, please, Brian. And here's 2 quotes that were taken from the open-ended questions at the end of the questionnaire. As you can see, they're all related to socialising, sharing experiences, just a chance to get together with other residents, chance to socialise. And they've mentioned some of these activities. And as you can see, the second participant there has said that he was living alone before, but now he's got a new interest since living in that housing setting. Next slide, please, Brian. In those comments from that open-ended question, some mentioned that they didn't mention the activities, but they did actually mention, oh, it's just getting together with other neighbours, just being around other neighbours, just that kind of community ethos and having that community feel of that housing setting that made them feel included. And this kind of points towards the fact that it's not always what specific activity is taking place, whether that's bingo or coffee mornings, whether it's keep fit. It's just a chance to get together, a chance to share experiences, and a chance to develop companionship as that Pobble residence is there. It's getting out and about, talking to neighbours and sharing experiences. Where there wasn't positive comments about activities that made people feel included, it was mostly because of the lack of communal space, and that's why activities couldn't take place. So that's just a brief snapshot of what we found at the end of the survey and qualitative responsives to the questionnaire, and the phase 2 qualitative fieldwork where we're talking to residents and interviewing residents will expand on this further. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Alex. So yeah, so you know, we've put a lot of work already, and thanks. Yes, I should clarify, I was getting that a bit wrong. This is not from the qualitative field work from the interviews. This was actually responses, write-in responses to the survey. So we're still talking about the questionnaire phase of the work, but nice to get a bit of that qualitative flair, get a few of the more detailed stuff, the personalized touch. We're going to move on now to hear from Jeremy Porteous, who's Chief Executive of Housing Lynn, again, another partner of the DICE project. And I've known Jeremy again for quite many years now, working on this important sector. He's had a distinguished career, but I won't take up too much of your time, Jeremy. Over to you.
Brian, thanks ever so, and it's really great to hear you and our fellow contributors leading up to now. The Housing Lynn has had a long relationship with the University of Bristol and yourselves, and we've been delighted to be party to this project, both in terms of sharing the learning and also communicating, disseminating it, but also previous projects. And some people will remember the ECHO project and the ASSET project funded by the National Institute of Health Research. And it feels to me that this is a natural progression to think much more beyond the physical, to think about the social interactions, and where extra care housing plays a really important part in binding communities together, both communities of older people in individual schemes, but also as part of a wider community. I'm going to talk on a little bit about sort of at a higher level, some of that macro stuff that Paul sort of touched on, and then just going to focus it down, because obviously our minds are being very much exercised by COVID-19 at the moment. So Brian, if you wouldn't mind moving the slide on. Some of the things I've been really sort of exercised on is about where over the last few months we've been very much sort of teetering between ageism and age heroism, where we've had some real challenges around the way we think about and operate our care homes and some of the guidance that's been issued nationally for that. And in the absence of some coherence and leadership in terms of political leadership for some of that, how we've moved very much around trying to identify how our residential accommodation for older people from retirement living, extra care and care homes plays a really important part around supporting vulnerable adults pursue their health and well-being. And we then sort of go right to the other end with, you know, the death of Vera Lynn last week, Jack Charlton this week, and the sort of glorification of Tom Moore, and, you know, this really important contribution that he's made. And we seem to miss the sort of cohort of people that this research project is very much about, the real life, making it real for the experiences of people living in ordinary housing. And it does touch on an element of age discrimination and the disadvantage that there is in society. And if anything, I think COVID-19 has exposed some of those inequalities and moreover shown an explosion of loneliness as a result of that. And despite some of the sort of positive things that you've identified around Wi-Fi connectivity and the resilience sort of being built into systems. So if you could just move on a little for the next slide, this sort of 4 key dimensions that sort of Paul touched on, I think sort of really much fits in to thinking about how do we make sure that we have those effective social networks at a local level to sort of build sort of greater resilience into both our systems, but also into the behaviours and culture, both the way we operate our extra care housing, but also enable older people and residents to take control of the types of communities they live in. And it's not just about the sort of physical architecture, it is very much about how we create the right social architecture for that as well. And what's really encouraging with the 3 partners here is that they very much embrace that. And I think those quotes that you shared show that. But we also need to think about this sort of broadly, about the fact that a lot of this is being done by chance. What we really need to do is build a community chest, which is societal, which enables us to think about the way we develop more collaborative models of housing with care, something I've termed collaborage. It's about supporting people across aging of all ages and those collaborative models. And what we know from the next slide is that there is a high number of older people who live in ordinary dwellings. You know, most people live and actually are owner-occupiers. There are about under 500,000 people who live in residential care accommodation, but there's a large slice of people who make a very valid decision, a lifestyle choice or a care choice to be care ready to live in retirement housing, of which about 75% of that is in the affordable housing sector. But we know from sort of research that we've undertaken with the local government association that there's a significant shortfall of good quality housing with care, the type of accommodation that enables and generates those community links. And we think that over the next 10 years, if not more, we need at least 34,000 new homes a year at a time when up until COVID in March, we were only building between 5,000 and 7,000 across all 10 years in the UK. So we need a significant explosion in terms of our commitment to thinking about the delivery of a better housing choice for an ageing population, but also issues around the quality of that as well. So if we can just move on a little bit to the next slide. Back to the COVID issues. If you haven't been aware of any of the sort of work that Lynn's been doing over the last 3 or 4 months in relation to this, we do have a comprehensive information hub and have produced a number of practice briefings which look both at the operation of supported living and specialist housing, but also issues like how to address things like bereavement or end-of-life care. So it's not just about the moving in and supporting people in wellness, but also about having a good death, and some of the real challenges over the last 3 or 4 months about people who've suffered significant grief and loss, let alone the experiences of either inpatient hospital or discharge, or indeed experiencing COVID itself. So if we can move on again, please, Brian. The issues about loneliness at a high level are really significant, and the ONS have only recently sort of reported on this, that 5% of people in the UK state they feel lonely either often or always, and this actually increases significant to those people who think it's been impacted on their well-being. And if you want to look at where this happens across the country, Age UK have got a heat map of loneliness as well. And today the Campaign to End Loneliness have published a report as well about the lived experience of people who are lonely and isolated. But I think this also shows that the housing offer to support people both in their own homes, but also those who make that positive choice to live a life in an extra care and housing with care, that there are some opportunities there to strengthen the experiences and to reduce the loneliness in those schemes, as comes out of this really initial findings from this research. And the work that we've been doing behind the scenes has been pulling together some of the examples that Alex has described eloquently just a moment ago, to think about the way that those connectivities, that social architecture that I referred to, can be better addressed to sort of both look at the way people manage their experience around social distancing, both in the accommodation, but out in the community, but also to remain and retain those social contacts, how to better be linked into digital if they're not, to challenge not the inclusion, but the exclusion that is fundamental to the inequalities I set out right at the outset. So sort of drawing to a close, I wanted to sort of touch on the next couple of slides on some of the physical, having described some of the social. One of the things we've been doing in the LIN has been thinking very much about the happy quality design standards. And those of you may have noted that the Happy Design Awards for Care Readiness were published and announced last night. And some of the sort of key characteristics of that, which really has an impact on this project and I think beyond, is about how can we redesign and rethink about the type of quality of accommodation that we have? How can we make best use of creating safe and secure spaces, not just for the belonging and longing that Paul described, but also the health protection, the security, the infection control, and also maintaining those social distances. And I think the thing about extra care housing and housing with care by and large is that the communal space, the broad corridors, the access to outside have played all a significant part in reducing the exposure to COVID-19 in many, many cases. And again, I was on a conference call this morning with another provider in Wales who had not experienced any in their extra care housing. And some of this is about making sure there's good quality access to natural light, good private balconies, how the accommodation can be adapted to cope with change, where can it be technology enabled so it's called more care aware, and how to maintain both those formal and informal contacts. The next slide, please. And one of the fundamentals is where, again, the housing with care offers a community hub. It offers a purpose-built opportunity here for multi-use, for co-working, for on-site staff, but also for meeting areas, bumping spaces for many residents to maintain the social networks and social contacts we've described. So I just wanted to end by saying I'm really pleased to be part of this project. We very much look forward to sharing and cascading the findings more widely later this year and next. So thank you very much for inviting me this afternoon. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Jeremy. And there's his contact information for people. And I do highly recommend you check out the Housing Lynn website if you have any need for resources, because they've got a vast library. And I'm not only saying it because I know some of my work features on there quite prominently.
Of course it does.
Yeah.
Excellent.
We're going to move on now to Jane Ashcroft, Chief Executive of Anchor Hanover Group. I've heard Jane speak on a number of webinars already during this crisis. And so I'll turn it right over to you, Jane, because I'm sure you're going to have great comments for us.
Thanks, Brian. Yes, afternoon, everybody. Always difficult to follow Jeremy, who packages loads of information into a distilled period of time. Some of those themes I'd like to follow through on and build a little bit more on. A quick overview of Anchor Hanover, just is from 55 years of age to 109, I think, is currently our oldest resident. We operate in 85% of local authority areas in England. And what we're about, we sum up
Jane, we are
trying to achieve by saying we want.
Jane, we are getting delay and lag on.
Okay.
I might turn it over to Christina and just to give you a chance to communicate with my colleague and reset if you need to, but we'll make sure that you get on with us. So Christina, putting you a little on the spot because I'm sure you thought you had a few more minutes to think and respond and plan, but if you don't mind, it'd be great to hear from you. For everyone out there, Christina Rees is Community Services Manager at Brunelcare, and they are one of the providers of housing with care support that have been part of the project. So Christina, please give us your thoughts.
Hello. I did think I had a few more minutes. I was not prepared. I also hoped if I was at the end, I could shorten my speech. So that's ruined that for me. I wanted to take the opportunity to talk about COVID, just because actually that's been really difficult for extra care housing. So we are normally in a lovely position where we can provide activities, we can really encourage kind of that community feel, people coming in, people coming out, external groups being able to use our space, people making friends, and obviously friends, families and other professionals coming into our buildings. So it's been hard. And actually, when you're talking about kind of social inclusion and loneliness, actually the last 4 months have been really hard. And we've really noticed the difference with the guidance changing and us being able to open up a little bit more and allow people back into the schemes. We've been really fortunate, and I have no wood around me. We've had no cases in all three of our schemes in Bristol, and I think that's our tenants have really understood the guidance. Maybe not the first week, And they have been really good at kind of, if they are using our social spaces, they are social distancing. And I think the beauty of having extra care housing was, although they're independent living and they have their own front doors, they have been able to see people. One of the big things we tried to do, and it was interesting because you talk about technology and I'm shocking myself, and there's definitely an age thing there. We tried to get families connected as much as possible using digital technologies, and we had lovely volunteers who raised money so we could get some extra tablets within the scheme, because we were using personal devices and trying to get people connected there. And it's definitely something we will keep going after COVID, which hopefully won't last much longer, which we've always done for families abroad, but we've never really used it for families that are local. So actually that's been a lovely change. It's something we will make sure we continue to do. And it has kept people connected, but I think it is that personal interaction that really, really helps. If Jane's back, I'll happily swap to Jane.
Oh yes, great. Thanks so much, Christina. I think it's really, I mean, commendations to you. I mean, it really goes to show with some of the, messages around care homes and COVID, the fact that you've been so, able in the Bristol schemes to avoid any infections says a lot for the quality of your service. So, but thanks for your comments. And yes, we do have Jane back. So over to you, Jane.
Thank you. Many apologies. I'm sorry. Technology seems to know the critical moment, doesn't it, to go down? And thanks, Christina. Sorry to swap things around. Really conscious of time, and I know people have got lots of good questions. So we operate a range of services, including lots of retirement housing, shared ownership retirement housing, rented, and also we operate care homes across the country. And we have a very diverse customer group. So all of our customers are older people between 55, as I said, and 109. Many of our customers will be living with elements of disability. An increasing number of our older generation are from BAME backgrounds, and we have a very active LGBTQ plus group in the organisation to help our residents from the LGBTQ community to get the best out of life. I think one of the important things about retirement housing services is that they may be specialist, but they're not separate from the rest of the community. And I think that's very much exemplified. We have lots of links with into local communities, lots of school links, lots of links with faith groups, which are very important. Our services are ideal locations for many local groups to host get-togethers. So we work with Age UK, with Dementia UK, with many faith groups and others to use our communal facilities to enable those external organisations to come and be part of our community. And I do think that older people's services, housing with care services, really thrive when they are part of a local community, and our residents really benefit from that too. However, I think, Brian, the statistics that we've seen and the work that's coming out of the DICE project does show us that there's always more to do. And clearly some of those numbers of people who find that socialising and being involved in the social aspects of services challenging and uncomfortable is one of the reasons why I've got colleagues across the country who work in our services, whose job essentially is to help those communities to live effectively together and for people living in our services to thrive. In terms of inclusivity, some of the areas where we focus, we do recognise the importance of financial inclusivity, and I know that this study isn't particularly focused in that area, but affordability and having resource is such an important part of quality in later life. We have a team in Anchor Hanover who we call our Be Wise team, and these are experts who understand the detail and intricacies and ever-moving situation around benefits and the things that many older people may be entitled to and aren't yet claiming. The Be Wise team add a huge amount of value to our resident group and take away some of the financial worry that some of our residents have, to enable people to cross that worry off their list and to have more confidence perhaps in terms of socialising and getting involved in activities. We also recognise, and I'll come back briefly to the theme of technology, sometimes the digital deficit for the older generation can be a challenge. And for some time now, we've been running sessions which we call Tea and Tech, which are about people getting together, always over a cup of tea, often involving cake, and learning and sharing together skills around using everyday technology to help people, particularly whether that's about the benefits agenda, which of course is increasingly online, or whether it's about communicating. It was interesting to see Brian's slide about social connections and people using telephone connection, text, email, and increasingly, of course, one of the things that COVID has done is really pointed people to other platforms. And I think we've seen a huge uptick in things like FaceTime, House Party, WhatsApp video calls, undoubtedly a bit of a silver lining to what has been a very tough time for many communities. And also it was interesting to see on Alex's slides some of the activities that people referenced that helped a community to feel inclusive. So coffee mornings, bingo and fish and chips leapt out at me as things that I see very regularly in our services. But also mentioned there were wellbeing and health activities. And we've certainly tried to support our residents who want to make sure that they are active. We have an initiative at the moment called 10 Today, which is all about encouraging people to take 10 minutes of exercise a day. This is very much focused on our resident groups. We have a great guy who lives in one of our services who is a retired fitness instructor, and he fronts our 10 Today initiative. There's videos available on YouTube made for 10 Today, and actually BBC Sounds have picked up the 10 Today baton and done some work on that too. And we've also recently linked up with Diana Moran, who some of you may remember as the Green Goddess, who is similarly doing some work with some of our communities and providing video-based exercise. Of course, COVID has meant that many of those physical activities have simply had to come to a stop. And so, as I said, technology has come to the fore, and we have tried very hard to support our residents to make sure that where it's possible, technology has replaced what used to happen in a physical sense. I think it's really exemplified the value, though, of the communal facilities in retirement with care settings. And that lounge, that treatment room, that space that people have been used to has been very missed during the period of lockdown. So while we have been able to replace some of those things virtually, and things like the 10 Today videos I think have been really well received, we've also had, my colleagues have been doing brilliant jobs of creating quizzes that people have been able to do online, and probably all the sorts of things that we've all been doing on a Friday night with our friends, and perhaps the odd glass of gin in my case. Too much oversharing there. We also found, though, that during the period of the most extreme period of the pandemic, when so many services and individuals had to be in lockdown and shielding, that actually that issue about loneliness and isolation, we had information available about people who had no contact or no local support networks. And as well as linking people with local authority support mechanisms, which in many cases have been invaluable, we put in place an approach called Be Supportive, which is a telephone-based befriending service where colleagues across Anchor Hanover have made regular contact with our residents for a chat. So not to talk about Anchor Hanover or repairs or rent or anything like that, but to have a chat with people. The interesting thing for me is many of my colleagues who've been involved in that have been colleagues who typically work in our back office functions. And during this period, those people who perhaps haven't had as much work to do have had free time, and we've redirected them to this Be Supportive approach, as well as residents telling me that they have found that really enjoyable and they've enjoyed having a chat with somebody. Interestingly, my colleagues have learned so much more about our residents and really understood what we all focus on in Anchor Hanover, which is that every resident is an individual. And despite somebody being categorised by their age or their gender or the disability they may be living with or the area in which they live, every resident is an individual, and it's great to get to know people on that basis. And just to complete my short comments here, I think the other issue is about inclusivity of colleagues across the sector. So the relationships between people who work in our services and the residents in our services are absolutely critical. That's what makes the biggest difference. And I was really struck, we've been celebrating Pride Month recently, obviously in a very different way this year because we haven't been able to get involved in the usual events. But that has been a really integrated celebration of Pride with residents and colleagues celebrating together at a local level. much of that virtual celebration rather than physical. And I think inclusivity, recognising the importance of the workforce in these services alongside the residents, is one of the most powerful messages. So in summary, I think older people's housing with care services are assets that we often see the value of the physical asset in a community, and I would always want to encourage communities to come and use our assets. But actually the older people living in our services also provide that they are assets. They have knowledge and experience which they share with schools, with my colleagues, with local communities. And that's the best exhibit, I think, of inclusive services that I see around our organisation and around the sector.
Great, thanks, Jane. As always, very inspirational, and it's wonderful too that you're really bringing us back to some of the underlying, the crucial underlying points here, which are about structure, supporting inclusivity, not only for let's say residents, but also taking it into account the element of the workforce. So we're going to go on now to have a bit of a discussion and question and answer. I do encourage our participants out there listening, post your questions. I will start going through them and foster our debate. We've got a few in already, and one of which there's a direct one for me around my sort of related to what I was talking about, the little evidence of ghettoization. But it's specifically, and I think quite rightly, asking whether or not the social contacts we identify are external to the housing with care and support scheme, or if it's within it. So is their social circle limited to the scheme? And the answer to that is we didn't have people directly sort of identify where their external contacts resided, but we did ask them about whether or not when they met up with them, that takes place in or outside of the housing setting, or both. And I would also highlight that, the three contact categories, you've got friends, but you've also got children and family and other family, and it's relatively unlikely, it's not impossible, but it's unlikely that people in these settings would be with their children. It does happen, but it's not across, not universal. Or but when we asked about where they met their friends, it was about 44% of them are meeting them outside of the housing setting. 38% are meeting them both in and out, and the remaining about 18% are only meeting them within, which to me suggests that at least, if their friends are coming from the setting, they're still actually doing a lot outside of that. So I think it's a very good question just to unpick whether or not those social contacts do extend outside of the scheme. But I think the evidence we have from the survey is suggestive that it's not. But going and bringing everybody else in here, I think we've got a lot of questions that have come up related to, and unsurprisingly, to the coronavirus situation. And I think I'd like to start there. And thanks to all of our respondents, to Jane, Jeremy, and Christina for already touching on this and addressing it. I suppose the first question I would have, and this, maybe I'll go to you first, Jeremy, to see if you've got a good answer to this. To what extent do you think that the sort of the underlying social aspect of this kind of housing, and I'm very aware of this housing being promoted for this sort of social engagement, reduction of loneliness. To what extent do you think that, or the messaging around care homes, might really dampen people's the future demand, the short-term, medium-term, or long-term demand for this kind of setting? To what extent do you think the sector is going to have to do damage control, let's say?
I actually think there's going to be hopefully little damage control. for two reasons. One, I think while people may want to remain in other housing settings for longer, there will still be a need to think about the lifestyle choices they want to pursue at some point, and whether they want to right size for care readiness, or indeed at a later life because of an additional care need which cannot be managed or supported in their current accommodation. So what we know is that a number of people moving within extra care, moving in their early 80s, it may well be that may shift a couple of years or so. The challenge will be whether how much increased dependency there will be and the type of arrangements in terms of the planned care as well as the self-care that can be delivered. But initial sort of anecdotal information we've got through the LIN is that there's probably been a little bit more demand to think about housing options and wanting to move to extra care because they don't see it as a care home. I don't know whether that's the same with Jane and Christina, but that's our initial information.
Yeah, if I can hop in there, that's exactly our experience, is that I think many people living in the family house have perhaps found lockdown really challenging. And so we've definitely seen there were people who were already interested in our services who have come to us at the end of the period of lockdown and said, I'm really keen to move. And definitely seen an uptick in interest. I think there is always the confusion about the different types of services that are available. So at the beginning, I mean, Brian, you tried to describe all of the different labels that we use: extra care, independent living, assisted living, very sheltered housing, retirement villages, off we go. And I know that is challenging. And Jeremy highlighted that some of the coverage about care homes in particular has been very one-dimensional and stigmatizing. And unfortunately, I missed much of what Christina said, but I think she was talking about, which has also been our experience, that it has been possible to support and protect residents in the majority of care homes from what has been a really tough challenge for those who are frailest in our community. But fundamentally, I think, certainly in the short term, there is an increased interest in good quality housing with care, by which I mean well designed, in the right location, an affordable offer for people. So a range of tenures, whether that's a social housing offer or whether it's a home ownership offer. And I think hopefully one of the positives about a difficult time is that we'll have a better debate about what ageing really means, and understanding how we can all prepare for our own later life. So not thinking about the older generation as they, but one of my obsessions is thinking about the older generation as we, because we are the future older generation. And so I think there are, while there will be challenges, particularly around some of the reputational issues in the care home sector, I do think there's been an increased interest, both from potential customers and residents, and also from policymakers.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great point too, to try to shift the thinking, just to shift it from thinking they to thinking we. I mean, it's sort of fundamental to the question of othering, which is, inherent to all of these discussions around diversity. But Paul, staying on this theme of COVID-19, I mean, is there anything you or Alex want to mention around how how COVID-19 has really introduced any new concepts or new ideas to how we might approach the field work moving forward, particularly in this context where if demand is increasing, but we've got to challenge these narratives, I mean, I believe that this project can really help with that. But do you want to comment at all on the plans to incorporate COVID-19 into the project?
Sure, thanks, Brian. So yes, COVID-19 has changed the way we're doing the research. It's meant that we're not able to do any further face-to-face interviews. So we've had to move to remote ways of working. It's also provided us with a springboard to explore what the impact implications are for COVID-19 on people's friendships, interactions with other residents, social connections, both within the scheme and external to the scheme. So it's probably a little bit early for us to talk about what's coming through from the interviews, because we've just started going back to some of the residents that we interviewed in January and February to learn about how things have changed for them. But I will flag up that two colleagues of mine in my department, Karen West and ELSA Cameron, and ELSA's a member of the project team for this study, they've been doing a really interesting study looking at extra care setting in the southwest of England during COVID-19 and learning about residents' experiences. And their research has just highlighted the importance of balconies as a really important space for each resident to interact with each other, to have socially distanced conversations, and to be part of collective experiences. So say, for example, where there is a bereavement within the scheme, Karen and Elsa have gathered anecdotes of residents who have joined together standing on their balconies as, for example, a hearse has driven past the scheme. So being part of that bereavement process, that collective bereavement together, and recognising and celebrating a resident's life who's lost their life during COVID-19. So some really interesting work coming out there about the physical architecture, to use Jeremy's words, how that impacts on the social architecture.
If I could just come in on that, I think that the balconies are a critical thing, and it's one of the 10 design principles of Happy. The other thing which probably isn't thought about is also deck access, which provides another way of having an interface with the internal and the external. But certainly balconies, I'm just minded by the very early images, and Jane may remember it in Italy and Spain, where people were singing on their balconies in very dense communities. And in a sense, we have a really good example of where balconies, as Karen and Elsa have been doing.
And I don't know if Christina is still on here. I've lost her video. Oh, great, Christina. I wanted to just ask you too. I mean, sort of shifting alongside those questions, those principles to which you allude, Jeremy, the architecture, this design. You talked about the natural space, the access. You also emphasized the tech question. And Christina, you mentioned about some of the tablets, the shift in approach you've taken toward tablets. I just wondered if you wanted to expand a little bit more on any other lessons or thoughts related to the use of technology, or any other plans you have for enhancing the tech experience, and whether you might want to answer. We've had a question come through about whether or not residents are responsible for getting their own Wi-Fi in their individual flats, and or is this sort of taken care of for them?
I can try and answer. That was a lot of question. So currently our spaces have communal Wi-Fi that does reach the flats, but if someone wanted to be able to join a webinar or be able to for the connection to work really well, then we do advise they get their own individual internet in their own flats. I loved Jane's idea about mainly cake, but the kind of cake, cup of tea, and technical kind of groups. I think actually we'd really benefit from that. We did do the friends on the phone, and we found that was quite a nice uptake, but actually it is that kind of learning around digital working together, kind of those partnerships. And I think that was what was really missed when we had to shut down our schemes. So there's definitely room to improve with technology, and not assuming that people don't know how to use it. So I'm 32 and joining these webinars scares me every time I get a link. But we've got a gentleman who's 92 and he can do pivot tables and all sorts. So there is that kind of making sure we set it at the right level. It's knowing what people need to buy and what connects to what. So I think we've seen loads of progress in the last kind of 3 to 4 months, and I'd love to see that continue. But yeah, the kind of Wi-Fi, our communal Wi-Fi is fantastic. So if you're in the lounge and you want to cast a film or whatever that is, that can easily be done. But in the flats, if you wanted really good connection, you probably need to get your own Wi-Fi, yes.
Yeah, and the same is true for us. So all of our schemes have the communal Wi-Fi, but that has been a challenge in a period of shutdown when many people have been isolating in their own apartments. And I think it's an interesting thing going forward. Jeremy's talked about Happy, and a lot of the work we've done over the years on kind of built environment and design standards, some of the infrastructure pieces to enable the tech, I think, have become, Wi-Fi is kind of turning into the hot water of today, isn't it? It's just one of those things that is going to be essential. So from a provider point of view, the opportunity to think about that when we're building new services is great. There's quite a challenge retrofitting into existing services, but undoubtedly the technology is here to stay. And as Christina said, age of itself is not an indicator of whether somebody will be tech savvy, tech interested, tech obsessed. We've certainly got lots of people using our services who are brilliantly tech savvy, and they're often the people who are then helping their neighbours. I think one of the things we've really found during COVID is we've got the vast majority of our communities have been incredibly resilient, and some of the the rather stereotypical views that people on this kind of webinar wouldn't hold, but a lot of perhaps the mainstream media do, about the kind of vulnerable old community. Actually, there's a lot of resilience amongst older people, and people sharing their knowledge and their skills has really helped communities through the tough bits. And technology is definitely one of those areas where people have shared their skills.
I wonder, there's, some of the questions I've seen from our participants and in the past is, I mean, Jeremy, you alluded to it. I'm doing some work on it currently, that, there has to be some really strong movement in construction, in development of new units and homes just to keep up with the natural evolution, demographic evolution. I'm here, one of the things I hear, we're talking about this tech infrastructure you just referred to, Jane, which I think is spot on. I think that's true. We're talking about perhaps creating very nice homes that are, of high quality, that include all of the things that they need to include. On the one hand, does that create challenge? How do we address the challenge that comes with that in terms of getting new stock built, getting the sector developed to meet the emerging demand? And if these are at a certain level, what are our options for ensuring that different subgroups of the population don't get excluded from the opportunities to live in them?
Do you want me to kick off?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, we're expecting a planning white paper in the next week or so, and I think there's a real need to think much more strategically, spatially, how we build housing for older people of all types into our planning policies. And I know it's something that ARCO and others have long advocated as well, and we support that. So there's a piece for planning. I think also that closer alliance between housing and health, where one is looking at healthy neighbourhoods and healthy living, support people in their own homes as well as where they want to make a choice. And I'm on the panel of Homes of 2030, looking at what the future design will look at. And I think that interrelationship with health is going to come out a little bit more, perhaps learning from some of the lessons from the Healthy New Town. And if you're interested in this area, the Town and Country Planning Association, TCPA, are recommending a Healthy Homes Bill, which looks at some criteria around to think much more about our physical health, but also our broader mental and social health as well.
Yeah, I would completely agree that there's some planning issues which actually from a government point of view wouldn't be costly, but they could really make a difference for the development and the stimulation of the market for housing with care. I think also the focus on social care reform, the increasing evidence base, and those of us who work in the sector have known this forever, but it's the evidence base that's particularly important. And the Housing Lin and others do great work on demonstrating this, demonstrating that good quality housing with care can really reduce demand for social care or focus social care in the right areas, I think is really important and timely. I think there's also some opportunities which might arise out of some of the economic shifts that we're seeing at the moment. So for instance, some of the challenges that the retail sector is facing, the opportunity to think about reusing high streets, thinking about town centres in a different way. For some older people, living in a town centre would be an attractive proposition that's probably not been possible from a development point of view for some time. Actually, the dynamics around town centres are changing significantly. So I think there's some kind of fundamental infrastructure pieces around policy where there could be some steps taken. And then there's some other things that are a little bit more kind of reactive to current circumstances, all of which could really help to generate more of the housing with care that we undoubtedly need in our aging or our longer living society.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it seems like it makes sense for, methods, and whether it's through strategic reform of planning, but ways for local authorities to recognize everything that both you and Jeremy just said, because local authorities have a lot of responsibility for social housing, for delivery of social care. Joining these up, it just seems like that would make a lot of sense. And from what I've heard, there just appear to be a number of barriers that create just significant challenges for the right kind of levels of progress to be made. We are running out of time, and I promised Jeremy I would give him a chance to say he's got to leave a little bit early, but I'll go around to everyone and ask you for just your final opportunity to make final thoughts. So Jeremy, please.
Well, first of all, thanks very much for inviting me. I think my final thought is that some of this requires both is a leadership challenge, but we are all the leaders and we need to demonstrate that and how we can support a change in culture around thinking around ageist practices, so we can sort of not have that what I call the ageism and age heroism sort of ping pong going on. So I think this is really something that's fundamental to creating a much more inclusive society.
Thank you. Yeah, great. Thanks, Jeremy.
Take care.
Cheers, Bob. Jane, how about your final thoughts?
Thanks very much. Yeah, it's been great to be part of the discussion, and I'm sure we could talk for days. I think it's exemplified the interconnectedness of so many key themes. So inclusivity sits alongside and at the heart of issues around community, issues around the built design, issues around the market, issues around demand, and it's been great to touch on all of those. I think that there are some positives coming out of the last 4 or 5 months when people are thinking differently about what are key workers, who are key workers, what really makes a difference to people's lives, what does it mean to be part of a community, what is my neighbourhood. And I think it's great that a lot of people I know are really focusing on that. And just to come back to something I said earlier, I suppose my closing comment would be, I do think if we think about ageing as we, not they, it changes a perspective. And one of the things I love about my job is we're building stuff that I would look forward to living in later life. So thanks very much for a really good discussion.
Great, thanks. Christina, any final thoughts from you?
I think just thank you for having me. I think it's great that there's so many positives coming out of something that's been so horrific. And hopefully this will continue a conversation and we'll see greater improvements in the future. I think if you look through the last 10 years and where we've come from there to now, I think we're on the right track. And if we keep talking, if we keep communicating, if we keep kind of pushing each other, I think we've got a bright future ahead of us.
Great.
Yeah.
And Alex and Paul, I'll give you just before my final words. I'll give you the final words.
I'll mute myself, that'll trick again. I just wanted to say 2 things really, just to pick up a really good point that Jane made about the importance of valuing staff from diverse backgrounds. I think that is really important if we are really serious about building inclusive, well-connected environments where people feel they're equally valued and recognised. And in our research, we're testing that out in a number of ways. So for example, we've got some short vignettes about people from minority or marginalised backgrounds, their experiences of housing and experiences of discrimination. And we ask residents, we're asking residents to respond to those vignettes to sound out what they think should happen. And we're also asking staff what they think should happen and what would happen in their scheme. So to get both staff and residents to think about what it looks like to address discrimination, both in terms of practice and in terms of the wider organisation as well. And the final thing I wanted to say, it picks up what Jeremy said about, we're talking about different types of housing. And we're focused on one umbrella of housing types, which is housing for older people with care and support. But of course, that model is not always going to work for all older people. And I just want to end on that point that we also need to recognise that we need investment in lots of different models, mixed models of delivery for housing for older people, which could be co-housing, for example, with friendship groups. It could be intergenerational housing. I know there are lots of people, including in our own department, who are looking at research around that area. So yes, we definitely do need more investment in housing with care and support for older people, but we also need to make sure we've got that investment and the eye on focus on other forms of housing as well that works for different people from different backgrounds.
Great. Alex, do you want to say anything?
I think Paul's covered most of it, but just say that it'll be exciting to continue the conversation from our data through our qualitative phase once we get that in the next few months.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, so I want to thank first and foremost to all of the people who have spoken and given their energy and their thoughts to making today's webinar happen. And I think it's been a fantastic discussion of a very important issue. Also, of course, thanks to the Economic and Social Research Council for believing in us and funding our project so that we could do this work. Been very vital to this. And there will be, as I mentioned, we will be having further developments, further opportunities for engagement and to hear more about the project over the next year or so. And then from me, just final thoughts from ILC, just a reminder for folks who know, and to tell you if you don't know, that you can work with us through our partners program. I mentioned that at the beginning of the webinar. This on your screen shows a little bit of the things that you get from the partners program. And thanks again, Jane and Anchor Hanover, for being a partner for so long. If you're interested, contact my colleague there at the bottom of the screen, Redvers. And we, again, reminder and letting you know, our Future of Aging conference is going to happen again this year and on the 3rd of December. I just heard today that an executive decision has been made and it is going to be completely online and digital this year rather than trying to work out because of the uncertainty given the situation. I'm sure everyone can understand, but do check out our website for more information on that and how to register. Again, thanks to all of our partners and everyone who's been involved. And don't hesitate to get in touch and find out more about us and our webinars for the future. Thanks a lot.